Welcome to lecture number 3 with Professor Sweeney in History 1302. That's my cat. Her name's Newt Newt. She's really cute. So she might come in and out of the video. With this crazy world, my husband might come in and out of the video. My kid might come in and out of the video. My grandson might come in and out of the video. I don't know. We have to prepare for all craziness. But today we're going to focus on World War II. We're going to take a closer look at World War II. And the words that you need to focus on for this particular lecture are fascism, Joe Louis, the Eastern Front, and the Briserio program. So today, like I stated, we're going to look at the nuances and contradiction of World War II, and we're going to start by looking at totalitarianism, because there are different types of totalitarianism that is happening internationally during World War II. And both of these totalitarian regimes that we're going to look at have differences. Both fascism and communism were totalitarian-style governments. Both had single parties that are highly centralized with no elections, no party competition, and the parties are headed by single charismatic dictators. That's very important. But these systems of government, both of these systems of government attempted to control every aspect of people's lives. And that's where the total in totalitarianism comes from, in case you were wondering. And so there is no individuality allowed in these systems. There's no freedom of speech. But they also had very important differences. So, I mean, of course, there's some similarities with how these authoritarian regimes are managed, but there's a lot of differences as well, and those differences are very important because I don't think that a lot of people understand that there are differences, and so we want to focus on that for a minute. With Soviet communism, you have Stalin in control of the Soviet Union by the late 1920s. And he believed and said that individual freedoms had to be subordinate to the greater good. When the Soviet Union was first created and when you had the Bolshevik Revolution, when you had this overthrow of the Tsarist regime in Russia, you had Vladimir Lenin, who originally took control and headed this new Soviet Union that was created, and he believed and said that it was a worker state, like that. It's all based on, loosely on, of course, the ideas of Karl Marx, and so there's this belief that he was creating a worker state, and that initially, while the revolution was being carried out and while they were converting everything in the country to this worker state, that they had to eliminate and get rid of any sort of disagreements. So any disagreements had to be eliminated, and the reasoning behind that was because you had to squelch the disagreements and get the system in place, and then once the system was in place, then they could reopen individuality. They could reopen freedom of speech and revisit a lot of these rights, because then everyone would be happy with the new system and everyone would understand the new system, and those who were against it, those who had held power in the previous regime, or those who had benefited from the previous regime, it would give them time to kind of eliminate that possibility of losing their new power in the Soviet Union. And so as far as the economy goes, what the Soviet Union did was they confiscated private property. They took all of the property that was owned by the elite, by the nobility, by the hierarchy, and they took all private property and they began to redistribute that. It's a vast, centrally planned socialist economy is what they are moved to in the Soviet Union. And they declared itself, again, a working class internationalism. that's how they referred to themselves, as a working class internationalism. And it predicated itself on the protection of the proletariat and the worker. Again, everything that was done in the Soviet Union and in Russia was done on the premise that it was going to create a better society for your everyday worker, for your everyday citizen, for your everyday Russian. And so that's what's happening from there. And that's very different than fascism, which is the other totalitarian type regime that we're going to look at next. It is, in Italian, the bundle of sticks, the Italian fascist symbol was a bundle of sticks, and that's because they believed that a bundle of sticks was much stronger than one individual stick. And so in this fascist system, individual freedoms are subordinated to the needs of the fatherland. Whereas, again, in the communist Russia, the individual freedoms are subordinated to the protection of workers, the creation of a worker state. But in Italy and in this fascist system, freedoms go to the wayside to hold up the needs of the fatherland. They believed in racial superiority, a master race. For Italy, of course, that's the Mediterranean, and for Germany, we know that that will be the Aryan, and even for the Japanese, they will have an imperialist race that they will elevate themselves. And so they believe in racial superiority over whites and over Asians. For the German and the Italians, they believe in their own racial superiority. And all of that was used to justify different forms of colonization, because you should know, and I don't think that it's a surprise, that, you know, Hitler, of course, is going to go in and invade all over Europe, and he's going to do it in the name of the fatherland and in the German superiority, his ideas of German superiority. And he's going to take more and more and more resources and more land from southern Europe, and he's going to do it all and he's going to use his ideas of racial superiority to justify what he's doing to Southern Europe and then Eastern Europe. So fascism coexisted with capitalism, which is very important because communism doesn't coexist with capitalism. So you have fascism that is very comfortable in a capitalist system. You have, what they have, though, is not laissez-faire capitalism, it's protectionist capitalism. So even though the word Nazi has socialist in its name, I have to hear this all the time. People tell me, well, Hitler and the Nazis were socialist, but they weren't. Even though socialist is in the name, socialism is an economic policy, and Nazis were very capitalistic in their economic system. They are actually very deeply anti-communist. They are mortal enemies of it. In fact, socialists are mortal enemies of fascism. Fascism is an intense nationalism. Things like our country, for the fatherland, those are all words that are connected to and associated with fascism and fascist ideas. And the idea that it's a country's God-given right and destiny to expand, that's very closely linked to fascist ideas as well. And everywhere that it goes, it claimed to protect traditional values. But these are all new ideas and values. They are not traditional ones that fascism is all about. Of course, like in Mussolini is the leader in Italy that institutes and kind of creates this fascist regime, and then we know that Hitler was very much a fascist and created a fascist regime. So you have Soviet communism, which is totalitarian, and then you have fascism, which is also totalitarian. They are very centralized. Both of them are very centralized. Both of them have similarities, but I hope now that you can understand that they both also have very distinct differences, and you can't just lump them together. Fascism and communism are not the same thing, not even remotely, and so you cannot put those two together. But both had supporters in the United States, and that's what we need to talk about and focus on, because this is a U.S. history class, and so we have to talk about these things in the context of the United States. Both had supporters in the United States during World War II. You had the Fascist League of North America, which were a lot of Italian immigrants, around 20,000 of them. And even beyond those who actually joined, you had a lot of, a vast majority of Italian Americans or Italian immigrants in America or their descendants supported Mussolini. He seemed to be a very strong leader. They thought that he would elevate Italy's position in the world. And in turn, because he was such a strong leader, they thought that if Italy was elevated, then their status in the United States would be elevated, because Italy would be such a more highly respected nation than it currently was. So they thought that that would give them some sort of elevation within the United States. And so that's something that's really important. And even those who didn't all out support Mussolini, they still weren't horrified by him. And then we have to look at support for Germany as well, because Germans were really successful in the United States in organizing support. So you have the German Bund, which has 25,000 members. In 1939, they actually have a rally at the Madison Square Garden, like one of America's most symbolic convention centers. They have a rally there. And so there's a video on your PowerPoint that you can pause and watch. It's about the American German Bund or Bund. And so you have Americans who are very enthusiastically supporting Hitler at the beginning of World War II. So you have Italian fascist groups and you have German fascist groups that are growing in support within the United States. And you also have native-born United States citizens forming their own fascist parties. You have the khaki shirts, which had about 2,000 members. Those are U.S.-born fascists. And then you have the silver shirts, or the Legion of America, and they had 15 to 25,000 members. And almost all of them were born in the United States. And there was even a conspiracy that formed within the United States where a bunch of businesses plotted in 1933 to overthrow the president, Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. There was a plan by U.S. businesses to overthrow him and create a fascist dictatorship in the U.S. And because they were very enthusiastic about Hitler and Mussolini. There was a general good feeling about clamping down on communism, because communism wasn't compatible with capitalism, and fascism was compatible with capitalism. So a lot of big businesses in the United States were at least sympathetic to fascist regimes, much more so than communist ones. And so this conspiracy to overthrow FDR and create a fascist dictatorship was actually backed by J.P. Morgan, General Electric, U.S. Steel, DuPont. And I mean, those are businesses that are still around today. So it's crazy to think that they actually momentarily entertained this idea of trying to overthrow the U.S. when all of the propaganda for the time period is aimed at communists and their desire to overthrow the U.S. government, which there's very little evidence anywhere suggesting that was even on a communist radar at any point in time. Meanwhile, fascists were actually planning to, or talking about trying to overthrow the U.S. government. It's very interesting. Because and of course it was in, you know, it was big businesses that were backing this. This was in the early 1930s, and that's because the business community was upset about the New Deal. They were upset about how they thought the New Deal was cutting into their profits, and so they floated this idea of totalitarianism as a way to avoid losing any sort of profit in their business model. The 1930s also serve as a high point of the Communist Party of the United States. Yes, there is a Communist Party of the United States. In 1929, it had 9,000 members, and by 1938, it had more than 100,000 members. Their influence reached very, very far, and that is because they embraced a strategy known as the Popular Front. They gained influence in the United States by establishing non-communist organizations, but they are ultimately pursuing communism. But a lot of these Popular Front organizations weren't necessarily outright trying to defeat capitalism or pursuing communism, because they did a lot of things such as create anti-fascist groups. They are the only party in favor of equality. So the Communist Party very much gained a lot of support with minorities because they completely 100% supported equality. Uh, the USSR is terrified by fascism, and so they want nothing to do with that. And the Soviet Union was looking at Germany and Hitler, and they really feared invasion. And most people that were involved in this Popular Front in the United States are not themselves communists, but they helped the Communist Party gain influence by supporting these organizations. And that will haunt a lot of people during the McCarthyism of the 1950s, which we'll get to in about a week. And those are fun lectures, so I think that you'll enjoy them. But there are members of the Communist Party that are fully supporting the USSR and fully supporting Stalin. And they ignored the famines and the purges that were happening in Russia after Stalin's takeover of the Soviet Union. You also, during this time, have the Spanish Civil War, where the fascists are backing a military coup against a leftist Spanish government, and the U.S. and other Western countries declared neutrality. But the U.S. is definitely going to support a more fascist group in Spain than they are going to support a left-wing government. The U.S. has volunteers, like 3,000 of them, that go and fight for the leftist government in Spain. And, okay, so the hardest part of studying World War II, I think, without question, is talking about and dealing with the Holocaust. I generally show videos in class of footage from when these concentration camps were liberated, and so I'm going to pick out a handful of videos and I'm going to embed them or upload the links into Canvas, and it's absolutely essential that you watch them. They're hard to watch, it's horrifying, but I think that the more time that passes between the Holocaust and, you know, the present, that people become more and more desensitized to it, and we tend to put more distance between it. And so I think it's very important to look at these images and these videos and try to understand how horrifying of an event it actually was, and what it must have been like for these people to have lived through it, these family members that survived, these family members that survived and the rest of their families didn't, and just the absolute toll that it took on societies all throughout the world. The Holocaust has different stages. Hitler didn't start right off the bat by having these camps where they were gassing and putting Jewish people through stoves and, all of that wasn't the first step. They took small steps. So in 1933, you have um, the first eugenics laws that are going to be passed in Germany, and they're modeled after California sterilization laws. Um, and then you also have restrictions placed on Jews in Germany that are based very much on Jim Crow laws in the South that are restricting Jewish people to certain parts of the city, restricting their access to different places, restricting their visibility in public, what they can do, where they can go, and that's how it started. They placed laws on them like Jewish people couldn't intermarry with Aryan people or white people. And it's very much based on those same segregation laws that were in place in the United States during the Jim Crow era. But then in later years, they instituted what's known the final solution. That's when Hitler launched the idea to turn these work camps and to create these concentration camps where they turn Europe into a horror film. Um, there were 30,000 slave labor camps created, 980 concentration camps, 1,000 POW camps, 500 brothels full of sex slaves, and 6 extermination camps. Auschwitz alone is responsible for the death of over 1 million people. And while all of this is happening, while it's going on in Europe, the U.S. refuses to accept any escaping Jewish immigrants. They refuse to suspend quotas to allow more Jewish refugees to come into the country. And they even refused visas within those quotas. And the Jews have nowhere to go, nowhere to go at this point. In 1939, the HMS St. Louis, which was a ship, was refused in Cuba. It was refused. In Florida. There were 933 Jewish refugees on the ship, and when they tried to land in Florida, the U.S. refused to allow any of them to enter into the country. So ultimately, those 933 Jewish refugees were returned to Germany, where they died, in concentration camps. And when we talk about the Holocaust, there were millions who died, and they weren't all Jewish. There are, I think, approximately 6 million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust, and roughly 4 million others, to include political enemies of Germany, socialists, communists, homosexuals, the mentally ill, gypsies, different racial groups that they didn't like. All of those were subjected to concentration camps and final solutions. And so everyone was kind of practicing this idea of isolationism, and it's particularly difficult to think about the fact that the United States could be directly responsible for the deaths of so many people who were seeking refuge from these concentration camps, these gas camps, all of the horrible things that were happening in Germany. But the U.S. wanted to stay out of European affairs. American citizens, for the most part, wanted nothing to do with European affairs. And so, 23% of Americans favored war with Germany. That's less than 1 in 4 people in America wanted to go to war with Germany. They didn't want any part of it. In April of 1941, only 9% favored war. They wanted to concentrate on the U.S. They didn't want to have anything to do with Europe. And so that's important to remember, is that most Americans were just dealing with this isolationist attitude of, we want to focus on the U.S. We can't allow ourselves to become involved in what's happening over there. There are a lot of symbolic victories that are going to happen during World War II. A lot of African American anti-fascist victories will occur. In 1936, you have the Berlin Olympics, where it was supposed to be a showcase for Nazi superiority. And Germany wins the medal count, but you do have victories that are going to happen, like Jesse Owens, who is going to win. And you're going to have the German Nazi superiority Aryan, who's going to come in third. Unfortunately, Jesse Owens was a black athlete, and when he returns to the United States, the only job he can get is with a circus sideshow. And Matt Robinson goes back to the United States, who's also an African American athlete. They took first and second in one of the biggest events in the Berlin Olympics, knocking the Aryan to third, which was a symbolic victory. But again, when they returned to the United States, Jesse Owens was forced to work in a circus sideshow, and Matt Robinson was forced to become a sidewalk sweeper. And they were not allowed to wear their Olympic jackets in public, and they were treated pretty poorly, unfortunately. And then you also have in 1938 Joe Louis, and they orchestrate a rematch between German boxer Matt Schmeling and African American boxer Joe Louis. And this rematch is going to be in Yankee Stadium. It is the most listened to event of the era. And what it was supposed to do was really showcase how superior, again, that the Aryan athlete was to the, to other minorities and non-Aryans. And Joe Louis, of course, as I already stated, was African American. So it was supposed to be a referendum on support of Nazis and Aryanism. And so the rematch was like Aryanism versus anti-fascism. And so Joe Louis had fought in World War II. Schmeling was not a Nazi himself, but he was used by Hitler. And so, of course, Joe Louis wins. There's a link to that in your PowerPoint, so you can click on that and watch the fight. It's pretty cool, actually. It's pretty neat. You also see anti-fascist popular culture. You see popular culture attempting to mobilize against fascism, and with that you have the launching of Captain America. You have Captain America issue number 1, and that a picture of it is in your PowerPoint, so you can look at what that issue looked like, what the cover looked like. It's kind of important to look at it because I want you to make some comparisons as we move through and talk about stereotypes and talk about different enemies and stuff, like how they were visualized in America. So again, make sure you're going through your PowerPoint presentation so you can see these images. I might get super good and figure out a way to like flash them in here, but I don't know if I'm gonna get that good at this. My husband's researching it. We'll see what happens. But for now, you gotta watch the lecture and you gotta look at the PowerPoint. So anyway, you have Captain America. Issue number 1 comes out a year before Pearl Harbor, and the creators are all American Jews, and they were well aware of anti-Semitic campaigns that were happening against Jews, and they're happening, of course, in Germany with the Holocaust, but there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the United States. We've already talked about instances of that up until this point. And so in this issue of Captain America number 1, you can see Captain America is punching a Nazi's punching Hitler like right in the face, and he's just getting him. And Captain America originally received a lot of, it had mixed reviews, which is hard to imagine. It received a lot of hate mail and death threats because they claimed that the creators were just Jewish warmongers who wanted to drag Americans into European affairs. But then you also had your very big supporters. And they received a lot of fan mail from that too, but it was not universally received and seen as a positive thing at first. You also have The Great Dictator, which was a 1940 movie. It was the first talking movie for Charlie Chaplin. And Charlie Chaplin was very much a member of the Popular Front that we already talked about. He was very much an anti-fascist. And the plot of this movie that he created was that there is this dictator called Hinkler, who is played by Chaplin, and of course he looks just like Hitler. He copied Hitler's mustache, he copied Hitler's look, and so you have Hinkler, and then you have a Jewish barber or butcher who looks just like him. And so what happens is, much like The Prince and the Pauper, an old fairy tale, you have Hinkler and the Jewish commoner who are switched. And so it's a comedy, basically. And most of the film is very, very funny until you get to the final scene, which is something that Charlie Chaplin did all himself. It ends, the movie ends with the greatest political speech ever made. And I think one of you had already said that you had seen that or heard it or had some experience with it. Most of you probably have not. That video is absolutely crucial to watch. You have to watch that video, which I have posted the link to on the PowerPoint. And if it doesn't work, then all you have to do is YouTube Charlie Chaplin, The Great Dictator, or greatest political speech ever made, and it will come up, but the link in PowerPoint should still be available, and it shouldn't be a big deal. So go watch it. I'm not even going to finish the lecture until you go watch it. So pause me, go watch it, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so now you've watched the greatest political speech ever given by Charlie Chaplin, and you'll notice that he's looking directly at the camera while he's giving it. It's very emotional. It pulls you in very intensely, and he did all of that, of course, on purpose. It meant a lot to him. We don't know exactly how Hitler felt about the film, but we do know that he had 2 private screenings of the film, but no comments were recorded or are known. So when war breaks out in 1939, the Allies initially are China, Poland, France, and Great Britain. Very quickly, Poland is going to be occupied, then France is going to be occupied, and so you have China, Great Britain as really the main players who are fighting the Axis. In 1941, the USSR joins the Allies when Hitler invades Russia. So now you have China, Great Britain, and the USSR. And after Pearl Harbor, of course, you're going to get the US joining. And it's a really weird team when you stop and think about it. For that matter, so is the Axis, because you have Germany who's fighting this whole idea of Aryanism. They're creating this final solution, and they're promoting this Aryan race, but then they're joined with an Asian country. So it's very odd. And then, you know, the USSR with China and the United States and Great Britain, that's not exactly a super normal team either. So it's very odd. When you look at the Eastern Front, which is the USSR front, the Soviet losses are astronomical. Over 10 million soldiers will be affected by this. They have a lot of men, the Soviets do, but they don't have a lot of supplies, and they have bad leadership. You'll have 13 million civilians that will be affected by this, and Germany will lose 4.5 million. But the Eastern Front, this Russian front, accounts for 74% of all German losses in World War II. Stalin himself said World War II needed the U.S., but that the USSR actually played a central role in winning the war, and it's absolutely true. The war couldn't have been won without Russia, and that's something that very often gets overlooked when studying World War II. Everyone likes to talk about how the United States came in and saved the day, but without USSR and the sacrifices that they made, there's no way that the war could have been won. Stalingrad was very much, the Battle of Stalingrad was very much a make or break moment. And it was days and days and days, hundreds of days in which 2 million people were killed. It was the deadliest battle in history, and it turned the tide and helped to push Germany out. If you look at the PowerPoint, there's a lot of things on casualties and deaths of World War II, so it's pretty important that you go through those just so that you can understand the magnitude of losses. When you look at the fallen of World War II, the numbers are staggering, especially when you figure in the Holocaust. Meanwhile, when you talk about the U.S., within the U.S., probably the most regrettable decision of FDR, the one thing that truly stains his presidency is his signing of the executive order that created internment camps for the Japanese. And it didn't matter if you were first-generation Japanese or if you were the descendant of a Japanese immigrant. Second, first, third-generation Japanese Americans were viewed as traitors. And unfortunately, horrible stereotypes were made about these Japanese citizens, saying that they were placed in the United States to wait for signals to overthrow the United States. And in 1942, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, which stated that all Americans of Japanese descent had to go to internment camps. And what's the most tragic about this is there is still to this day absolutely no evidence that the Japanese participated in any espionage at all. So over 110,000 Japanese were interned in these camps and lost everything. They lost their businesses, their homes, their bank accounts. Everything was taken from them, and they were placed in these internment camps in the United States. And yet we have no evidence of Japanese espionage. Unlike German, there was there was evidence of German espionage. So why did the United States focus on Japanese citizens and not German and Italian? Was it because of Pearl Harbor? Was it because the Japanese were responsible for Pearl Harbor? I would say that that is not entirely the reason. When you look at the words of the people in charge during this time period, they're quite horrible. The Secretary of War came out and stated that racial characteristics of Japanese made them untrustworthy. Lieutenant General John DeWitt stated that a Jap is a Jap. They had very racist perspectives on the Japanese. And you can see these racist ideas towards the Japanese manifest in popular culture of the time. If you fast forward from Captain America episode number 1 to Captain America episode number 13, or edition number 13, or magazine number 13, whatever you want to call it, you have them, Captain America, now punching the Japanese general. But there's a lot of differences. If you go back and look at the way Hitler was drawn on the cover, he looks very much like Hitler. He looks very much like a man. But if you look at how the enemy is drawn or portrayed when he's Japanese, it's a very big caricature. The Japanese leader has snake teeth. He has fangs. He has claws. Again, unlike Hitler, who when he was drawn looked very much like a human. Germans were not beasts or monsters like the United States made the Japanese out to be. And there's a lot of propaganda that will go along with that to feed that stereotype. Time magazine wrote an article that said perhaps he is human. They talked about wiping out murdering Japs. They had things like, there was an article called Keep Talking, I'm All Ears, and the article was about how U.S. soldiers were cutting off the ears of the Japanese and making them into necklaces. You also had Life magazine that ran an article, and the cover of the magazine was a nurse holding a Japanese skull. And And in the article, she talked about how her fiance sent her back the skull as a memento or souvenir from the war. U.S. soldiers took Japanese body parts and kept them as war trophies, and really talked about their racial inferiority. And that's a real big complication because the United States has Asian allies. So during this time, they start promoting Chinese are okay, and they repeal the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Immigration Act passed in the late 19th century, and allow Chinese to immigrate in. And they start publishing articles about how you can tell Chinese from Japanese because Japanese are monsters, but the Chinese are good. And this is very, very complicated. You also have the Philippines, which is an Asian nation. And so they're actually given their independence because the United States didn't know what else to do with them, and they didn't want to have to allow them to immigrate in. You have lots of complications. You have these stereotypes that will remain in place even though the United States has Asian allies. One of those is a comic book called Black Hawk, and it's a bunch of international allies who are going around saving the world from evil enemies, and the Chinese ally's name is Chop Chop, and I posted a picture of this in the PowerPoint, so when you see it, you'll just be absolutely appalled. Chop Chop, the Chinese ally, is very short. He's very horribly drawn, and he's a cook, and he cooks noodles, and it's terribly, terribly racist. So even their allies are portrayed in a very horrible light. The good news, though, is that World War II does end the Great Depression. You have the GNP will rise from 91 to $214 billion. There are more jobs than bodies during World War II because of rising war production. And they will create a program called the Bracero Program, which is a guest worker program, and it provides emergency farm labor. And it's a program that exists from 1942 to 1964. And it allows Mexicans to come into the United States and to work in these agricultural programs, but they are not granted any sort of citizen and they cannot remain. So they work and they go back. They also reestablished the War Labor Board from World War I in 1942. Per capita income reached its all-time high. Those numbers will never be seen again in the United States. It unionized jobs. You have an all-time high union membership. 1/3 of all workers were unionized. In 1942, they converted industry to war production. They had turned the economy into a government-run wartime economy, and they spent twice as much as the government had spent all combined in previous history, like ever. So if you look at government spending before World War II and you added it all up together for every single year that the United States was in existence prior to World War II, that spending could not equal the spending done in World War II. In 1940, government spending was $9.6 billion. In 1945, it was $100 billion. They increased tax rates in the U.S. They sell $185 billion worth of war bonds, and 45% of the war was covered. The rest was deficit spending. But the deficit spending does lead to the end of the Great Depression, which is good news. Next time we'll talk about the Cold War, and we'll look at the years 1947 to 1960 from an overall